Thank you, Barbara. So I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of Refugee, which is the Jewish Voice for Human Rights. My name's Debora Singer, and I'm the lead campaigner on human rights framework in the UK. I've been asked to give apologies from Mia Hassan-Gross, who's our executive director, because she's speaking at another meeting tonight. We're really pleased to be partnering with Wiener Holocaust Library. We've worked with them before. It's great to be here again. It means a lot to me personally because my sister and I have given our parents and grandparents letters and documents and photographs to the Wiener Library for their archive. As some of you will know, Reneca's role is to promote and protect everyone's human rights, drawing on Jewish experiences and values, and also empowering the Jewish community. And welcoming our two speakers, Zoe Gardner and Enver Solomon. And I'll give you a bit more about them when it comes to their turn to speak. It's very good to have you both here. As Barbara said, we're recording this, but just for our own purposes. My colleagues might be taking photos, but if they are, they're facing us because they like Zoe, me, and Enver best. So don't worry about that. Yes. So this evening, we're going to be talking about safe routes to home. And as we know that without safe and legal routes, people are forced to take dangerous and sometimes fatal journeys, and you'll have heard about that today, even in the news from Greece. So we want to talk about what can we learn from the past that when we consider how to provide more safe and legal routes now. And we're going to start with the historical context, and this is about my family. So Jonathan's going to be passing around the slides, and I'm going to ask you to share them between you. Just keep the whole pack together and just have a look. They're basically photos of my family. So my family, my parents, both came here as child refugees from Nazi Germany. They came from middle-class assimilated families, and they met when they were in their 20s here in London. I want to sort of tell you about the safe and legal routes that they used that were available at the time to escape Nazi Germany, Nazi Europe, and about what happened if you couldn't escape through those routes. And I'm going to start with my father's family. So can I borrow this a second? Sorry. Can I borrow it a second? Thanks. Sorry, I thought I wouldn't need one because I know what they say, but I do. Okay, so this is my father's family. My father's about 13 in the picture. He took this photo with the camera he was given for his bar mitzvah, and he will have set it on a timer and run into the photo. And he carried on doing that for the rest of his life. So with him, the taller girl is Susanna, that's his sister, who was 4 years older. And then also their parents, so Alex and Anna Singer, and they were both dentists. And it was quite unusual for women to be dentists at that time. So they all got out, and I'm going to tell you how they got out. And it was Susanna who got out through the most simple, in a way, the most straightforward route. And she and her husband knew that they needed to get out of Europe, not just out of Germany, but out of Europe. And they went to Brazil. And the reason they went to Brazil was because you didn't need a visa. So if you want the most straightforward, safe and legal route, go to a country that does not require a visa. So she didn't come to the UK because we required visas. She went to Brazil. Meanwhile, at around the same time, 1936, my dad was sent over to a school here through the West London Synagogue, and he was at Farnham Grammar School, and he was still in those years going to and fro from the school to his parents during the holidays, and the headmaster would write letters to his parents saying that he was doing fine, and then on the 9th of November 1938, Kristallnacht happened, so the Reichspogrom, the state-sponsored riot. And all across Germany, shops, businesses, houses, synagogues were vandalized, destroyed, burnt down. And most of the Jewish men were taken to a camp that would later become a concentration camp, although it wasn't at that time. And my grandfather was sent to Dachau. And he was told he wouldn't be allowed to get out of that camp unless he left the country. But he had to find a way to leave the country. And we know it was really difficult for people to get out. And so we're not sure exactly how it worked, but basically, my dad, Peter's headmaster, Dr. Morgan, and some others sponsored my grandparents to get out of Germany and to come to England. And that meant that they basically said that they would welcome them, they would pay for them, they wouldn't expect them to be taking any resources from the state. And in May of 1939, my grandparents came over to Farnham. They weren't allowed to work because the British dentists didn't like the competition from the German dentists. So they really did rely on the people who had brought them over. So there was a Jewish peer called Lord Nathan of Churt, and he paid for their accommodation for a flat in Farnham. But every day they went for their meals with Dr. Morgan and his wife and his daughter. They were a Christian family. And when people talk about the kindness of strangers, I always think of that. So if you move on to the next picture, and someone's going to have to give me this. Jonathan, can you give me one? Sorry. And yeah, and give me one of the other ones as well. Thanks. So this is my mother's family. This picture is taken from a photo album that my mother and her brother were given before they came here. So my mum's Hannah, she's got plaits. Her twin brother, Gerald, is in the middle. And then my aunt Ava, who was 7 years older and a bit put out when the twins were born. And then above them is their mother, Gertrude, my grandmother, and her husband, the children's father, Willy Korn. So when Kristallnacht happened, Willy Korn was also interned in one of these camps. This was in Buchenwald. And when he came back, he was like a sort of a different man. He was, his head had been shaven. He was really sad. He was finding life really difficult. And it was then that our grandmother, Gertrude, really sort of started working hard to get at least the children out of Germany. So she wrote to a friend of hers called Mary Caro, who was English, Jewish, well off, and they'd met in a Swiss finishing school years before. And so our grandmother wrote to this friend, Mary, and said, "Can you help us?" And Mary Caro just pulled out all the stops. She got a training visa, a nurse training visa for Eva, who was 17, who was then able to leave Germany in May 1939. She got Hannah and Hans, the twins, our mother and uncle, onto the Kindertransport, and that meant paying some money and also promising to find a way for the children to then live once they got here. So in their case, she put them into boarding school, but some people were sent to foster homes. And they came over in July 1939. And then when our grandmother came over, it was only 3 weeks before the war started and all routes were closed. It was in August 1939. And Mary had got her a visa, a domestic visa, by creating a job, really, that our grandmother should be a companion, a help to Mary's own mother. So that's how they all got out, all these different types of visas. But our grandfather, it was much harder for men to get out, to get visas, and it was much harder for older people to get out. And our grandfather was 51 by then. And on the day that our grandmother left for England to join their children, he escaped across the Belgian border illegally. And that was fine for a few months, but then the Nazis invaded Belgium, and all the Jewish people were rounded up. He was sent to some camps in France, and in 1942, in July 1942, all the people in those camps were deported to Auschwitz, and that's where he was murdered. I've got one final picture for you. So I wanted to sort of finish with our immediate family. So this is our grandmother's father, who is called Alfred Katz. And so he's our great-grandfather. And by the time he ran a bank, but by then the Jewish banks had all been closed. And by this time he was sort of in his 70s. He certainly couldn't get a visa to get out. He couldn't get a safe and legal route. And he knew, it got to about July 1942, and he knew that the next day he was going to be deported to one of the concentration camps. And so he took his own life. So that gives you some sense of what happened to people if they weren't able to find a safe and legal route. But if you think of the ones who did get out, it's interesting that quite a lot of those routes are still around today. So we've talked about countries where you didn't need a visa. We've talked about sponsorship, which is still around. We've talked about training visas, domestic visas. We've talked about the Kindertransport. It's a bit unusual. We wouldn't normally expect children to come without their parents, but it's very much an organized route, a bit like the Ukrainian route. And I hope that that's sort of a bit of a history lesson, just in terms of like my family, my sister's here today as well, gives you a sense of a bit of a context, a historical context on what we're going to hear now from Zoe and Enver. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Zoe to speak first, and then Enver, and then we'll have questions for all of us not right at the end, at the end. We're going to be finishing at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to ask Zoe first. So Zoe Gardner and I used to work together at Asylum Aid, and she's now an independent migration and asylum policy specialist, but she's also worked for JCWI, for the European Network of Statelessness, and for the European Council of Refugees and Exiles. So I'm going to hand over to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Really appreciate being here this evening, and such a great turnout, and in such a great host location as well. It really is an honor to speak in a place like this that holds the stories of so many people who have escaped from real horrific danger and persecution and been able to build new lives as part of our communities here in the UK. I think it's really symbolic of the time we're in, and I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in René Cassin's event this evening. Yeah, my name is Zoe Gardner. As Deborah mentioned, I'm now an independent sort of loudmouth on these issues, but I have worked with quite a few of the people in this room, and certainly I'm really grateful to Deborah for being the best manager ever when I was just starting out my career at Asylum Aid, and it was really helpful to work with somebody with such compassion and such a firm, clear-eyed view of human rights and what's right in this country, and that shaped me for the rest of everything I've gone on to do, to be honest. So I should really say that Deborah's amazing. Right, well, I think when I was asked to speak at this event, it was the day before the election was called, and I'm very aware that I'm just a loudmouth, as I say, but we're in a charity context here, and I know that this is a sort of non-party political space, and this is not an election campaigning event, but I have a little bit more leeway than charity folks do, and I do think that it's important to put this in the context of the election that we're talking about right now. It's a really strange election campaign. A lot of it feels like a foregone conclusion, and a lot of the debate that you might have been hearing seems to be more about what the opposition is going to look like after what looks at the current time like an inevitable Labour win. And I think that that should really be concerning to all of us, because we've gone through a period of time where there's been significant hostility towards refugee protection. And there's been a real, well, frankly, dishonest, inhuman approach to talking about the lack of safe routes, the lack of opportunities that we offer people to reach protection in this country. And there's been an effort, at least in some parts of the governing party, to turn our back on the history of protection that Debora talked about that's so important, even to turn away from commitments to things like the Refugee Convention and the European Court on Human Rights, which underpin that sad history that we just heard about, and that when we said never again in Europe, that is what we did in order to enforce never again. And so we've gone through a really, really horrible time. You know, chief among it, obviously, the Rwanda plan. I think we can all breathe a sigh of relief. It doesn't look like that's ever going to happen. And it looks like we're moving towards potentially a space where there will be opportunities to make positive changes in the asylum system. But within that, I do think it's important to look at that opposition and look at what's going to be driving the pressures on the next government, and who are they going to be listening to, and what are they going to feel that they are able to do. And that brings the impetus onto all of us, because it's so clear in a space like this how much refugee protection has shaped this country, how much refugees and migrants are part of our history, are present, and will be part of our future forever. And I'm sure that everybody in this room knows for a fact that there will never be a time when the UK doesn't provide sanctuary to refugees fleeing from persecution around the world. That is just simply not a prospect that could happen. And it's not because I'm hopeful, it's just realism. People will always come to this country to seek safety. And it's whether or not we facilitate that and make it safe that we have any control over. It's not a question of refusing that future, just as it's not a question of denying our history, which includes so many good things of offering protection and so many times when we failed as well. I think it's really important to point to the dishonesty. I have these conversations every single day. Anybody who knows anything about my Twitter feed knows that all I do is talk about the fact that there aren't safe routes for refugees, and that people as a whole do believe and have been told a lie, sold a lie, that people should in fact be applying for asylum from outside the country, and that's the legitimate way to do it. And if they end up trying to come here without accessing safe routes, that's because they chose the danger. And it seems unbelievable that people would believe that you'd get on a boat when you did have a safe option. But people do really believe that. And I think this is a real lack of understanding about very basic fundamental things about how migration works in this country. You know, Debora spoke about visas. You know, the number of people I speak to who don't understand that most people need a visa in order to come to the UK at all. I mean, we're very privileged. I'm British, and if most of you are British in this room, you should understand how privileged you are to not require an incredibly difficult visa process in order to travel. But most people, especially coming from the countries that produce refugees, do need that authorization, and we fundamentally do not give it. There's a very concrete example. 18 months ago or so, we introduced new visa requirements on people from El Salvador. And the reason for that was there was a change of government in El Salvador. There was a huge amount more political repression and violence. A couple of hundred people, literally a couple of hundred people, came to the UK because there was no visa requirement on people from El Salvador, applied for asylum, evidently were going to be granted refugee status, be recognized as refugees because they had fled that political violence and turmoil. And our government's response was to introduce new visa criteria to prevent that safe route from being open to Salvadorans. So we actively closed down safe routes for refugees. That is what we've done. And the danger is that the pressure will continue for that to be what we continue to do. Now, I'm a total geek. I've read the manifestos. Oh my God. Not a fun time. And, you know, if you look at the one that's likely to be leading the agenda for the next government, the Labour manifesto, they speak some warm words about the Ukrainian scheme and the Syrian scheme and the Hong Kong scheme, which is not exactly the same as a refugee protection scheme, but similar. And that's it. That's where they stop. And we can't stop at saying we've done some decent things in our history. We need to press for much, much better access to the asylum system. And I would add that schemes like the Kindertransport, thank God we did that. I mean, thank goodness that so many people's lives were saved. So many people who are, as I say, are part of our communities now, who otherwise would not have been. But what a terrible, terrible failure, really, in so many ways, that we only took children and we left so many of their parents to die. And that has been the model for so many of our other resettlement routes. It's focused on extremely narrow criteria of who counts as a vulnerable person, capped in numbers very, very often. And then, you know, just simply not a solution to the systemic problem of people who are displaced and need to find sanctuary. So all of those schemes, the Syrian scheme, you know, the Afghan scheme, such as it is or was, all of these individual bespoke schemes, I welcome them. They save people's lives. They are good things to have done, but they don't solve the problem. And I think when we're talking about the political conversation, people know that they don't solve the problem. People know that if you offer sanctuary to 20,000 Syrians, that, you know, 20,000 Afghans might still need help, and that we can't create one-off schemes for everybody. The Ukraine scheme was obviously a really, really significant difference in how we approach this, because the Ukraine scheme wasn't capped, or at least it was capped extremely high and it wasn't a hard cap. The Ukraine scheme was also shared across Europe. And I think that that's really, really fundamentally important, because no one European country can take care of all the refugees fleeing from any particular conflict, and certainly not, you know, with the millions who've been displaced by the war in Ukraine, that couldn't have happened. But the whole of Europe together said that they would facilitate safe travel for Ukrainian refugees, and together said that they would house and protect and provide the infrastructure needed to take care of Ukrainian refugees. And that is why it was such a success. And that is why 175,000 people have been accommodated in the UK with basically barely a whisper in terms of right-wing backlash. It can be done. And that needs to be the model for what we're looking at in the future, because if we don't grant systemic access to our asylum process, we will not solve the problem of people having to take routes to reach that process outside of the system. So I think when we're talking about this, and you're all clearly politically engaged people, so I hope that you're going to be continuing to raise your voices to the next government. And I do really, really worry that if they don't take a really bold approach to addressing the issue, then no matter whether they do it with slightly nicer intentions, and maybe introduce a few small one-off schemes that will help people, if the boats don't stop or significantly reduce, then Nigel Farage in the House of Commons, and a Tory party that might lurch ridiculously to the right, all of them baying for us to leave the European Court of Human Rights. You know, Brexit Mark II, Brexit was supposed to get rid of refugees. Obviously it didn't, and it never could. Now we're supposed to give up our rights to hold governments to account for human rights abuses as well. It won't get rid of refugees, and never could, but that is what the pressure will be from the right. And if Labour fails to take that systemic approach, that really ambitious approach, then I really worry about the outcomes. So I guess what I'm saying here is that we in this room, I would assume, are among some of the most pro-refugee people in the country, right? That you don't get better than us. And so we can't be shy. We cannot be asking for crumbs from the table. We've had a really hostile government, and we've got used to working with total dysfunction and in a context of major hostility towards refugees. And that is going to change. We have a huge opportunity, and we need to be asking for big, big change, because if we don't, no one does. If we in this room don't want a lot more and much better treatment of refugees, then no one does. And then nothing changes. So this is my urge whenever, and certainly to Enver, obviously with the Refugee Council, who will have a big voice in this, and we'll be able to speak to Labour, and you're going to hear about all the brilliant things they're asking for. But everybody in this room, Rene Cassin, and certainly Refugee Council, when you ask for things, ask for what you really want. Ask for the big thing, because remember, nobody else is asking for more than you. No one is asking for more than you. So we need to really be ambitious. We need to really push the next government to do better, because we're going in a really, really dark direction if we don't do that. So it's hope, but it's also, it's danger. It's both of those things right now. And we need to step up to the plate right now. It's a really dangerous time. So thank you. I really look forward to questions.
Thank you, Zoe. That was really, yeah, a really strong and vital input, and focusing on the limits to safe and legal routes, and the need for a systemic and ambitious approach, the need for change. Thank you so much, Zoe. So now I'm going to introduce Enver Solomon. So I know Enver as well. My colleagues laugh because I seem to know everybody. Enver was on the panel that gave me a job when I applied for a job at Asylum Aid with Maurice, who's also here. So Enver is the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council, and has also had managerial and leading roles in places like the National Children Bureau, the Children's Society at Barnardo's. Thank you, Enver.
Thanks very much, Deborah. So I'm just going to close this so I can have my phone so I can see my notes. It's great to be here. I think I was here last year for Refugee Week and caused a bit of a stir, but we won't go there. That's history now. And I might have even been here previously as well. This is a really important location. It's important for me personally. Solomon kind of gives it away, really, doesn't it? As a Jewish surname. My father's family came to the UK fleeing the pogroms some decades before the Holocaust. They came here as refugees under their own steam and found a way into the UK illegally, and then became legal and became reputable business people on the Wirral. My mother came actually on a safe route, fleeing apartheid South Africa in the 1960s. South Africa, of course, was part of the Commonwealth. She could come on a visa. She could come with her brother, and they could settle in London, having been sent by the family to come to the UK to find a better quality of life, because the family were concerned about the state of South Africa and the political direction it was heading to. At the time, Nelson Mandela hadn't made his walk to freedom, and my grandfather was in the leadership of the Indian National Congress that worked with the ANC, and my mother was working with Winnie Mandela in Soweto and driving her secretly to see Nelson when he was in hiding. So, you know, they were in political choppy waters. And the family view was it would be better if my mother and her brother came to the UK to settle and to seek a stable life, and indeed they did. So for me, this is personal. I wouldn't be here today, as indeed many of you wouldn't be here today, if this country hadn't welcomed people. That is the reality. And of course, this week is Refugee Week, and the theme is home. And let's just think about home. We woke up this morning, you might have gone to the toilet, you might have turned on the radio, you might have brushed your teeth, you might have made yourself some breakfast. We took it all for granted, didn't we? We probably didn't even dwell on the fact that we were able to do it safely. It probably didn't even cross our mind, because that is our lives. That is the stability that we have. But the reality is that there are millions of people across the world that don't have that stability, that don't have a place called home, or if they do have a place called home, it's a fearful, dangerous place, and it's a place that they need to leave. And I think it's easy to forget that in the luxury of our own homes, that home is not something that millions of people around the world take for granted. And you might have noticed the UNHCR data that came out last week, the global figures around the number of people that are refugees that are now in the tens of millions. But I think it's important to remind ourselves about some of those figures, because they set a really important context. So 7 out of 10 refugees are hosted in neighboring countries. They don't want to come anywhere near Europe or the UK. They don't want to go to America. They want to stay in the neighboring country. Why do they want to stay in the neighboring country? Because they want to get back home as soon as possible. Because we want to get back home. We want to be at home. We want to be in the safety and stability of our homes that you and I all had this morning when we woke up. 3/4 of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries. The so-called responsibility or the negative language used by those who are less supportive of a refugee cause, the notion of the burden, is not on us in the UK, or indeed Western European relatively wealthy countries, or the relatively wealthy countries that make up the G7. It's on poorer countries. It's on countries like Lebanon. It's on countries like Pakistan, where large numbers of people live in abject poverty. And it's important to remember that, because that is where the majority of people are hosted as refugees. And then let's think about who are refugees, which countries do they come from? And this is where I think it's actually really fascinating, because 3 in 4 refugees, 73% to be precise, originate from just 5 countries, 5 countries. Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, and Sudan. Well, we all know what's going on in Afghanistan. We know about Syria, because David Cameron, who was once Prime Minister, made an offer to welcome 20,000 Syrians. They indeed, Morris and the Refugee Council were at the forefront of calling for. It was a modest commitment. Venezuela, Venezuelans, obviously, that's not an issue for the UK, but it's absolutely an issue in that part of the world, in the Americas. Ukraine, so he's spoken in detail about the Ukrainian scheme, and Sudan. We'll pause for a minute about Sudan. At the Refugee Council, we have a number of staff from Sudan, and they are quietly and privately suffering whilst the appalling conflict in Sudan plays out behind closed doors. The world doesn't even bat an eyelid at what is taking place in Sudan today as we gather here this evening. Now imagine if the world came together and decided for those 5 countries, Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, and Sudan, we are collectively going to provide global capacity to look after the people displaced by what's going on in those 5 countries. Recognizing that some will want to stay in neighboring countries, so that is about supporting those neighboring countries to look after people in the way the large numbers that went to Poland from Ukraine, because of course they wanted to get back to Ukraine as quickly as possible. Imagine if the world came together and thought collectively about how we support refugees from those 5 countries to either stay in the poorer, lower to middle income countries where they settle because they want to get back to home, or to welcome those through safe routes who want to move to other countries because of connections with community or with family or indeed friends that they might have. 73% of the world's refugees could be provided with safety overnight. Now that involves international cooperation and collective will to do that. And this is where I think we need to start having a different conversation about this. We need to have a conversation which is about how do we, as an international community, as a global community in a world that is increasingly global, provide safety to those who are far less fortunate than us? What is the collective responsibility of humanity? Because no one nation can do it. That is a reality. The UK could not take all the people from Sudan, Venezuela, Syria, and Afghanistan, and Ukraine. It involves a shared response across the global community, and that's about changing the conversation. And this is where we stand at a critical point in the development of the global conversation, not just about refugees, but the global conversation about who we are, about whether we as a collective humanity have a collective responsibility to those across the globe who suffer hardship and suffering and have to flee for their lives as refugees. And whether we collectively, as a global community, have a role to play in not just seeing a world that is about us, our nation states, and them, those in other parts of the world less fortunate than us, but actually transcend the us and them, transcend the conversation which is dominant in Europe today, whether that's in France, where there are going to be elections, or whether that's in Italy, where Meloni is in charge, or whether that's in other parts of the European Union, where there's a deep anxiety and a desire to build walls and to pull up the drawbridge. But have a conversation which is about what kind of world do we want to live in? What is the notion of a shared humanity in the 21st century that recognizes that collectively we have a responsibility, not just to think about the climate, but to think about humanity that are displaced by wars, by authoritarian regimes, often linked back to global histories relating to Western nations. And I don't make this point lightly, because I do believe that this is the argument of our time. And this is where we need to look to a new Labour leader, a Labour leader who used to work not far from here in Doughty Street as a human rights lawyer, to actually stand up collectively to shift the international conversation, because it can't just be done by one country. We need to have a different international view, a different shared humanity, and a different conversation among Western nations who have the power about how we respond to the current situation that isn't just about the climate, but is about the inhumanity caused by wars, by conflict, and by the rise of authoritarian regimes. That is the conversation we need to start having. And that is what we need to call on the next Labour leader to do. Gordon Brown saw it as his duty to make the argument to eradicate global poverty. He worked tirelessly to do that, not just poverty in the UK, but poverty around the world, because he believed that that was the right thing to do. He believed morally it was the right thing to do. We need to look to the next Labour leader to continue that tradition and to make the argument for a different world, a world that isn't about us and them, but a world that isn't about building walls like Trump wants to do. It isn't about pulling up the drawbridge like Meloni is doing in Italy. It's about recognizing that as a global community, we have a shared responsibility to address the causes of conflicts, to seek solutions to those conflicts, and to respond to the needs of those who are victims of conflict and persecution around the world. We need to look to him and to persuade him that that needs to be his legacy, in the way that Brown intrinsically saw it as his legacy about addressing the causes of poverty both at home and abroad. And we can do that if we make the argument, that transcends the narrow debate in the UK that Farage is wanting us to have, that looks at the bigger picture about the world we want to do in, that appeals to the values of compassion, of humanity, of fairness, of recognizing that together we build a better world. And that is the story. That is the story that the Wiener Library tells when you look at the archives, when you hear about Debora's story about her family. It's a story about a world that chose to respond to those horrors in a way that recognized the importance of a shared humanity, of international solidarity. Dare I say it, that the values that the Labour movement, that the next Prime Minister, if it indeed is Keir Starmer, that his movement is rooted in. And that is the argument we need to make. And of course, we need to have conversations with the government here about what it can do. It's not just about it's big or it's small, it's both. It has to be both. Change comes from incremental steps and making a big conversation and fusing them together. You look at any big social change that's happened over history, that is the story of that social change. And we need to do both. And it's about us collectively doing both and making the argument to a big shift about what is the world we want to be, what is the world we want to live in, what is the UK's nation in the role in articulating that world, and critically, what should a Prime Minister rooted in the values of Labour be articulating as the view of the world that is directly different from that is dominant today, led by the likes of Maloney and far-right leaders across Europe. That is the challenge we face. Of course, the next Home Secretary could do two things at a stroke of the pen. They could change the family reunion rules at a stroke of a pen. Family reunion is the main safe route to the UK. It has been tens of thousands in recent years. The next Home Secretary could change a rule so that a child could join refugee non-parent adult relatives in the UK. That is not possible today. Equally shocking, if I'm a child here alone in the UK, I can't sponsor my parents to be with them. Now, of course, we should be saying to next Home Secretary, fix that, change it, as well as making a bigger argument. We should be saying the UK Global Resettlement Scheme is at low numbers compared to 5 years ago. It's in the thousands, it's in the lower, it's less than 2,000 today. A few years ago, it was over 5,000. Of course, these are small numbers, but we need to demonstrate some small initial steps as well as making a bigger argument for a different world. Because the UK can't fix this. It involves the global leaders coming together and sharing responsibility and articulating a different vision. That is the challenge we face. And I think that is the importance of us collectively and our views going out and having the conversations and appealing to people about what is the world we want to see collectively as we move through the coming decades. And you can do that. You can do that in your workplaces, you can do that in your communities, you can do that in places you volunteer. And go and have the conversations with people who don't necessarily believe you, and have the discussion and have the argument and talk about the importance of shared values, of international solidarity, of a shared humanity and a global compassion. Because it's only if collectively we have those conversations about the world that we want to do in, are we going to get the big shifts that we need to see the safe routes that are so important. Because, and this is my final point, safe routes absolutely matter. We work in, I won't say where, because if I give too many details, I could give away people's identity. But the Refugee Council works in cities in the north of England. And last year I visited a hotel where there was a woman who had come from Afghanistan. She'd come on the safe route from Afghanistan. There was a hotel across in the same town where her husband and child were in. There was a hotel for people seeking asylum. They had come on a boat because they couldn't join her because there was no safe route through the family reunions to join her. What a ridiculous situation that her husband and child had to pay people smugglers to make a dangerous journey to come to the UK. You don't deal with people smugglers by just enforcement and control. You deal with people smugglers by providing safe routes so people don't have to take dangerous journeys. That is reality. But we need a collective vision of the world we want to be in if we're going to get the shift that you and I want to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Enver, for that call to arms and the need